Welcome to the Berggren Forum. I have two quick announcements. Tomorrow, the speaker in the series of environmental studies talks by people with an Alfred connection will be given by Kathy Rees. She's talking about promoting safe water resources in rural communities. Next week's Berggren Forum will be given by Rob Reginio, Professor of English and Western New York's leading authority on Bob Dylan. Rob's talk will be on Bob Dylan's outlaw ballads. I don't know how many times I've introduced Gary Ostrower in the past. I only know that without question and without any serious rivals, Gary holds the world record for Berggren Forum presentations. I also know that he doesn't just deliver in terms of quantity, he unfailingly delivers in terms of quality as well. As most of you know, Gary is retiring in December after 52 years of service to AU, so this will be his last Berggren Forum as an active faculty member. I'm pretty sure, though, that it won't be his last forum period, since I've already given him a standing invitation to present in future years. And I suspect he's still got quite a few Berggren Forums inside him, just waiting to get out. Now, quite a few of Gary's previous forums have included predictions about what's likely to happen in the future, say in an upcoming election. And his record for getting these predictions right is, shall we say, a bit checkered. Today, though, I think he's going to play it safe. After all, as Yogi Berra said, predictions are difficult, especially about the future. So today, Gary is going to confine his predictions to what happened about 80 years ago. The title of his talk is New Information About World War II. Take it away, Gary.
Thank you very much. Just one real quick other announcement. There is going to be, for any of you who are going to be teaching this afternoon, a session about Fulbright scholarships at 7 o'clock this evening on Zoom, and I think you probably have received some notice about that. Two things I want to say. Number one, Shakespeare said in hindsight, even the fool is wise. So maybe I'll be considered wise after I talk about the Second World War. And secondly, I just want to bring your attention to a book that I really like. I've used it in class. In fact, I'm using it in one of my classes right now. It's called Her War. There are two authors, really two editors. One is Catherine Doby, one is Eleanor Lang. The book is about the role of women during World War II. It's a series of short essays by in the first person, by people who were involved. I might add, by the way, that Catherine Doby happens to be the mother of the provost of Alfred University. So Her War is the title of that book. Now, I'm going to be reading my comments. I read because I get everything I want to say in. There's a little bit of specificity and some exactitude here. So I ask you to indulge me while I read rather than, merely speak extemporaneously here. 80 years ago today, Nazi troops had advanced deep inside the Soviet Union. And they were massacring Jews. They were massacring Soviet POWs that had become something of a Nazi sport. They had surrounded Leningrad, today that's St. Petersburg, and they were threatening Moscow. Now, Hitler in those days, he was the optimist. Okay, he believed that the war in the East would be over by Christmas, and that is of 1941. And after that, he would turn his attention, presumably, once more to England. Now, he had already attacked England a year earlier during the Battle of Britain. And that's when the Royal Air Force had handed him one of his very, very first military failures. At that time, Nazi planes had attacked British ports. They attacked British cities, British airfields, and they did so for about 4 or 5 months in a very, very intense fashion, all to no avail. German planes lost during the Battle of Britain 2,000 planes, and not just planes, but also, very importantly, 2,500 airmen, trained airmen, including pilots who, if they bailed out, did so over enemy territory, so they weren't going back home. British planes lost 1,700. But when British pilots bailed out, they did so over friendly territory, which meant that only 443 of those pilots were actually lost. And while those Nazi pilots, if they survived, kind of rotted in British POW camps, the British pilots who survived, and as I said, most did survive, they would fly again. And they would fly heroically in places like El Alamein and in Sicily and eventually in Normandy. Now, before I say more about the Battle of Britain, I want to remind you of something that we too often forget. And that is that the war did not start when Hitler ordered attack on Poland in September 1939. It began when Japan assailed Shanghai 2 years earlier in July of 1937. And it would not end for another 8 years, that is to say, until a couple of Japanese cities were flattened by atomic bombs. And I mention this because too often we kind of rely exclusively on an American version of this war. World War II would kill an estimated 40 to 60 million people, military and civilians, and 35% of them died in Asia. Of that total, 410,000 of those who died during the Second World War were Americans. Not 2,500 as we lost in Afghanistan, or 4,500 as we lost in Iraq, or 250 as we lost during the Gulf War of 1991. But as I say, nearly 500,000. And we should remember that figure, just as we should remember that we've already lost close to 800,000 Americans to COVID and still counting. But for crying out loud, you need to keep all these numbers in perspective, which is to say that although the US may have lost 410,000 killed in action during World War II, the Russians lost nearly 27 million of their citizens killed. 20 million of them were civilians. Now, I think you can do the math. That is to say, we lost about 2% of the Soviet casualties, yet we continue to think today that we won the war. Well, look, if the we means the Allied coalition, then of course the answer is yes. But Americans ought to remember that 90% of all Germans, of all Nazi troops who were killed during World War II, were killed in action on the Eastern Front, in other words, on the Russian front. The Americans and the Brits and the Canadians faced off against 60 German divisions on D-Day in 1944. At that time, there were nearly 300 German divisions in the East. That's what I mean by perspective. I want to return, if I may, to the Battle of Britain for another minute. It has often been said that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill mobilized the English language and sent it into war. I think it's a great statement. Most of you, I'm guessing, at one point or another have heard some of Churchill's addresses. Never have so many owed so much to so few. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender. We have but one aim. It is victory, complete victory. Now, the difference here, okay, well, maybe I'll put it in a slightly different way. I've heard these speeches, I've heard recordings, I play them in my classes. I think they're thrilling oratory. But is it true that we can, in fact, ascribe the British victory to Churchill, as so many of us do, to Churchill and the RAF, the Royal Air Force? And the answer is, you're darn right we can. Look, Churchill was no saint. A recent biography of Churchill by Geoffrey Wheatcroft paints a much less favorable portrait of Churchill than my own. Churchill was called the Bulldog. And by the way, I'm going to, if I may, share my screen here because I want to use some slides. So let's see if I can get this right. All right. Battle of Britain, casualties, Churchill. Okay. What I'm saying is that he was called the Bulldog. He was a feisty son of a bitch. And according to Wheatcroft, Churchill was not just a racist, but a hypocrite, a dissembler, a narcissist, an opportunist, an imperialist, a drunk, a strategic bungler, a tax dodger. You see it all right in front of you on this screen, okay? And he was a myth maker. Now, he was also an imperialist. Okay, he helped to draft tens of thousands of Indians and other Commonwealth soldiers into the British Army during the war. Many died to uphold England's imperial glory. Churchill was certainly not a military genius, a statement that I would back up by pointing to places like Gallipoli during the First World War. That was his defeat, as well as the campaigns in Greece and Norway during the Second World War. As a racist, he occasionally used the N-word, and he certainly viewed Africans and Indians as lesser breeds. He smoked smelly cigars. He told dirty jokes. He once insulted Lady Astor when he called her ugly to her face. She said, "Winston, you are drunk." And he shot back, "The difference between me and you, Lady Astor, is that tomorrow morning I'll be sober." If he had lived here In 2021 USA, some folks would be tearing down his statues. Now, no one ever described him as Mr. Nice, least of all Hitler. Churchill had an abiding hatred of Hitler and his grotesque ideology. As the war progressed during 1941, Churchill, who was not a religious man, prayed that the US would join Great Britain in battling the Nazis. Indeed, Churchill knew that the only sure way to victory was if FDR carried the US into the war in much the same way as Woodrow Wilson had done back during the First World War in 1917. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, followed by Hitler's colossally stupid declaration of war against the United States, should have convinced Churchill that there is a God. For the next year and a half, Churchill played the dominant role in the Atlantic. FDR deferred that is, until the spring of 1943, when the sheer volume of US troops and military equipment, especially destroyers and submarines and artillery, overshadowed the British contribution to the war and made clear that the US, not Great Britain, would call the military shots for the duration. By this time, Stalin, the Soviet leader, had defeated Hitler at Stalingrad and would soon give the coup de grace to any hope of a German victory at Kursk, which is one of the key battles of the war, where the Russians and Germans fought what in fact turned out to be the greatest tank battle in world history. Stalin, still facing a German army of nearly 3 million men in 1943, naturally wanted relief. And relief, he argued, must come in the form of a US-British second front in Western Europe. FDR and his chief of staff, General George Marshall, they agreed, but Churchill did not agree. The British in recent memory had nearly 800,000 young men killed during World War I, and they sure as hell did not want to become involved in a second war of attrition in France. Moreover, Churchill, the intrepid imperialist who confused the 20th century with the 17th, believed that fighting in Italy and in Greece, what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, that fighting would help to preserve British interests in the Mideast and in Africa and in India. Churchill won the argument, at least for the time being. And it wasn't only his persuasive gifts, but the simple fact of the matter is that in order to invade France from England, the Allies needed huge numbers of LSTs, landing ship tanks they're called, and Higgins boats, you see them on the right, okay, of Higgins boats, and those landing craft simply did not exist in 1943. So D-Day would be postponed by a year. In the meantime, some developments are worth mentioning that would have a huge, if less visible, impact on the fighting. The Germans were famous for their engineering prowess, and they indeed built some very impressive aircraft and tanks during the war. In a way, too impressive. For all their technical skill, they never got their priorities right. 3 million German soldiers invaded the USSR in June of 1941. Now, you may be surprised to learn that they utilized nearly 400,000 horses in that campaign. And they also mobilized over 2,000 different kinds of vehicles in their move to the east. And you heard that right, 200,000 different kinds of vehicles. Each of Hitler's 3 army groups, one headed north toward Leningrad, another in the middle toward Moscow, and a third to the south toward the Caucasus, okay? Each carried roughly 1 million spare parts. As historian Richard Overy put it, repairs became a nightmare. And this was complicated by the difficult terrain and the awful weather as winter set in during 1941. Likewise, tanks. Hitler wanted a tank that would outgun the reliable Soviet T-34. And the Germans produced 2 of them, one called the Tiger, one called the Panther. You see them here, with very thick armor and impressive firepower. However, these tanks were so heavy that they proved slower and they prove less maneuverable than their Soviet counterparts, which is why the Germans would massacre them at Kursk. For every 10 Tiger tanks, Overy tells us that the Germans carried with them only a single spare engine and a single transmission. And that's for all those spare parts I was talking about a few minutes ago. And the result, of course, was predictable. By the end of 1943, the number of Hitler's tanks had been reduced by more than a third. And while German tank production was 10 times in 1943 what it had been back in 1940, it was still not enough. Nor was the story of German aircraft any better. German plane production was unimpressive after 1941. Production was in the hands of an incompetent commander. His name was Ernst Udet, a man who is utterly unsuited for the high pressure demands of a serious war. Udet produced a number of new planes, of new kinds of planes, with a single exception, the Focke-Wulf 190. Every single new model that he and his team developed proved to be a disappointment. In fact, Overy calls them a total failure. With the Soviets now producing a huge number of less complicated tanks and planes, and with US aircraft production sweeping into high gear by 1943, the US would eventually produce 303,000 planes, with a typical fighter costing only $750,000, which in today's money would be about $7,500,000. Compare that to $334 million for a single F-22 today. And so you can understand why the Americans were going to outgun not just the Germans, but quite literally everyone else. And that, of course, means the Japanese. Now, General Hap Arnold was the U.S. Army commander, Army Air Force commander in Europe. And he was determined to produce planes that would serve the needs of air transport and strategic heavy bombing and tactical air support. Because Arnold and his superiors convinced FDR that the Germans had many more planes than they actually had, Arnold got what he wanted. FDR said, give him everything that he asked for. We firebombed cities like Hamburg and Dresden. And when I say firebombed, I'm talking about so much heat, so much incendiary fire that the air catches fire. More people died in those cities in air raid shelters from lack of oxygen. They suffocated to death than they died from burns. We decimated oil refineries in Ploesti and storage tanks throughout Germany. The Germans did produce lots of planes as late as 1944, but they sat useless on the ground because they lacked fuel and they lacked spare parts. But the Allied victory rested on more than just German failures. The US had become a technological powerhouse. I want you to think of the Norton bomb sight and sonar and the incredible production of B-24s and B-29s. Again, Overy. The application of technological strength through air power compensated for the difficulties in turning civilians into effective soldiers. The average GI was not quite as effective as the average German soldier. And ultimately, our technological superiority was going to make that meaningless. This was further complicated, I might add, by the fact that the Germans had too few tanks, too few guns at exactly the time that American technological superiority proved the difference between victory and defeat. So here is another example of what I mean. In the West after D-Day, 2 German mechanized divisions relied on 67,000 horses. Okay, remember, this is after D-Day. So we're talking about France, Belgium, Holland, okay, after D-Day. 2 German mechanized divisions relied on 67,000 horses, but Hitler only had 14,000 trucks available for the entire front. From June 6, 1944 until August 1944, the Germans lost half of their horses and almost all of their trucks. According to Overy, of 2,500 German tanks, only 100 survived. And that, I think, is simply, it's a startling figure to me. And although the German soldiers fought bravely, the Allied technical advantage further widened as 1944 turned into 1945. And there are two other factors to consider. Lots of American teenagers played around with their hot rods before the war. When these kids joined up after Pearl Harbor, they brought their knowledge of internal combustion engines and transmissions with them. Not so the Germans, who had few automobiles at home and little experience in repairing them. When a German tank failed, it became an impediment. When an American Sherman tank broke down, it was also often back in action within a few hours. Should I also mention that most production facilities in the US, like the huge Ford plant in Willow Run, which was just outside of Detroit, produced thousands of B-24 bombers. And those plants were working, not only Willow Run, but those other plants were working 2 8-hour shifts every day. If required, we could have employed 3 8-hour shifts. It proved unnecessary. And it's worth mentioning that the difference between US production compared to Japanese production was even more startling. In 1941, the US had 8 aircraft carriers. And you know, I think most of you, that our aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. They were out at sea, and therefore they were not damaged. In 1945, the US had over 90 aircraft carriers. And I might add, one of those, called the Bismarck Sea, is the subject of an op-ed that one of my students has just sent to the Olean Times Herald, and which I hope will be published on November 11th. The Bismarck Sea was the very, very last, it was an escort carrier, the very, very last carrier that was sunk during World War I, the last US carrier that was sunk during World War II, I mean. In 1941, the Japanese had 4 carriers. Eventually, they had 12, and in 1945, when the war ended, they had 0. Likewise, oil production. Because Japan had occupied the Dutch the Dutch East Indies after Pearl Harbor. That's the Dutch East Indies is today Indonesia. Okay, and because these islands were oil rich, Japan had as much oil in 1942 as it needed. In 1942, but increasingly, American bombers and submarines decimated the Japanese tanker fleet. By the end of 1944, the flow of oil to Japan had slowed to a trickle. The Dutch East Indies became a useless resource for Tokyo. Now, I want to make, if I may, one final point about resources. If you want to win a war, you need rubber. Planes and Jeeps and trucks are useless without rubber tires. And the Axis powers following Pearl Harbor corralled 97% of the world's rubber supply. I'm talking about the Japanese captured Dutch and British and Belgium and French colonies, including Vietnam and Southeast Asia, while Germany controlled the Belgian rubber producing colonies in Africa. So how did the US and its allies manage to win the war? And the answer is synthetic rubber. It barely existed in 1941. By 1945, virtually all of our rubber needs were filled by the marriage of chemical and rubber companies. And I should note here, as you see in this slide, that rubber by 1942 was rationed to the point that condom manufacturers were ordered to reduce their size by half. Aren't you glad you didn't live in 1942? Most of you, anyhow. Now, the US would build 51 synthetic rubber plants, compared to only 51 versus 3 built by the Nazis. As historian Daniel Immerwahr writes, just one such plant made enough rubber to replace a rubber plantation that had 24 million rubber trees and a workforce of 90,000. And that, wrote one historical observer, constitutes one of the greatest industrial feats of all time. It's the kind of thing that easily gets lost when we talk about battles. That's why we won the war. One of the reasons, certainly, we won this war. Now, I focused mainly on the European theater to this point. I want to say a little more about the Pacific War. In a word, it was ferocious. John Dower, who is a fine historian, teaches at MIT, I think he's now retired, called his book about the subject War Without Mercy, a superb title. I recently told one of my classes about a 1988 conversation I had with a survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack. And this is when I was touring Pearl Harbor. He was a sailor who was later assigned to the island hopping campaign of Admiral Chester Nimitz, of Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Pacific. This sailor told me that in 1943, he and his buddies found an American on one of the islands who had been skinned, and I mean literally skinned by the Japanese. I have no idea whether the fellow had been alive or dead. As he told us the story, he began to cry, and he concluded that he and his buddies would never again take a live Japanese prisoner. The barbarity of the Pacific War reminds me of Admiral William Halsey. His nickname was Bull Halsey's. Admiral Halsey's comment that the Japanese were not fit to live in a civilized world, having joked earlier that all Japanese males should be castrated. Does anyone listening to this Zoom, does anyone listening to this forum right now think that this kind of hatred did not factor into the decision to use atomic bombs in 1945? Which, as you can surmise, raises a fundamental question about World War II. Was it necessary to use these weapons on Nagasaki and Hiroshima? Here's an unambiguous answer. No. Here's why. 60 of the 66 largest cities in Japan had already been mostly destroyed by August 1945. 6 cities were being held out as targets for the atomic weapons. On the night of March 9th and 10th of 1945, 284 B-29s, the B-29 was the largest bomber in our Air Force, flattened Tokyo. They flattened Tokyo in a firestorm. Over 100,000 people died, and they died in a conventional raid. The city of Toyama was 99.5% incinerated in a raid that very summer. The list goes on and on and on. It's numbing. Moreover, the Japanese Navy by the summer was so decimated that it was unable to transport Japanese troops in China back to the main islands in anticipation of what the Japanese assumed would eventually be an American attack. In fact, the Japanese knew that they had lost the war. They knew that they had lost the war. This is Tokyo. They knew that they had lost the war. They put out peace feelers during the summer through still neutral Soviet Union. As early as April 11th, Tokyo's Joint Intelligence Staff predicted, if at any time, and you can read the words right in front of you, the USSR should enter the war, all Japanese should understand that absolute defeat is inevitable. Folks, this was in April. Japan's Supreme War Council confirmed that decision in May. At the present moment, when Japan is waging a life or death struggle against the US and Britain, Soviet entry into the war, said the War Council, Soviet entry into the war will deal a death blow to the empire. And so Tokyo offered to surrender if, the if is really important, if the US would preserve the monarchy and protect the emperor who, as some of you probably know, was viewed as having divine attributes. Truman rejected these terms because we had already demanded that the surrender be unconditional, both in Europe and in Japan. What the Japanese most feared in the summer of 1945, knowing that they had lost the war, what they most feared was Soviet occupation. Now, I just can't stress this enough. I'm going to put it in highlight. I'm going to put it in capital letters. I'm going to put it in bold font. The Russians had been neutral in the Pacific War since 1941. What Tokyo did not know was that Stalin, as early as February 1945, had promised FDR that the USSR would join the war against Japan 2 to 3 months after the war in Europe had ended. And it ended, I might add, on May 8th. After Roosevelt died in April, the new president, Harry Truman, eagerly anticipated Soviet entry, at least before he knew about the bomb. US officials estimated that the anticipated invasion of Japan would result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties. Now look, 16,000 Americans had already died at Okinawa, a small island 350 miles away from Japan. If the Japanese were willing to put up such resistance in a single island, what in the hell are they likely to do if there is an invasion of their main islands? And Truman himself wrote approvingly in his diary of the anticipated Soviet entry. He wrote that Stalin will be in the war. He will be in the war by August 15th. Finne Japs when it comes about. The next day, Truman assured his wife, we'll end the war a year sooner now and think of the kids who will not be killed. In fact, Truman had already referred 3 weeks before Hiroshima to an intercepted message, which he described as a telegram from the emperor asking for peace. Remember, this was before an atom bomb had been tested in New Mexico. So knowing that the war would soon end, why did Truman go ahead with his decision to use these terrible weapons? He already knew that some scientists and military officers opposed their use. Now, I want to be clear here. Truman explicitly rejected suggestions that the bomb not be used. He rejected suggestions that the bomb be used as a demonstration project on a deserted desert island. I think we can sum up his thinking in 5 points. Number one, inertia. Inertia. Politicians don't change course easily, and the assumption since the Manhattan Project was begun in 1942 was that we would use the bomb. Number two, Truman feared that the public would crucify him if they learned later that we had the bomb but did not use it to shorten the duration of the war. Number three, if the Indianapolis had been sunk, okay, the USS Indianapolis, you're looking at it here. The USS Indianapolis, which, as you noticed in my little footnote there, had delivered the first atomic bomb to Tinian. The USS Indianapolis had been sunk just 10 days before Hiroshima, with the loss of almost 800 American sailors. It was the greatest single naval catastrophe in all of American history. To Truman, the war was still on, and the bombs, he believed, would bring it to a quick end. Number four, once he knew that the Alamogordo test, we had tested a bomb in Alamogordo, New Mexico, back on July 16th of 1945. Once he knew that the test was successful, he wanted to shorten the war's duration so that Japan would surrender before the Soviets joined the Pacific War. He knew, as did the Japanese, that the Soviets would demand to occupy a portion of Japan as they were already occupying Eastern Germany. And fifthly, lastly, I'm not sure about what I'm going to say right now. Truman's Secretary of State, Jimmy Byrnes, had already expressed the belief that the bomb would make the Soviets more likely to accept American demands in the post-war world. And we are on the verge, of course, of that post-war period. In other words, the bomb would serve not only a military purpose, but a diplomatic purpose. Did Truman himself share these sentiments? Not certain, okay? Their evidence is simply inconclusive. He may have, but I'm not certain that he did. What we know for certain is that military sentiment was hardly unified on the subject of the bomb. 7 of the 8 US military officers of 5-star rank, 4 generals, 4 admirals, 7 of the 8 of our top military officers did not believe that the bomb should have been used. General MacArthur called the use of the bombs barbaric. He called it a Frankenstein monster. According to historian Ian Toll, who I think is our very best scholar of the Pacific War, Admiral William Leahy Truman's chief of staff said that the US, quote, had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Middle Ages. Admiral Bull Halsey, who I already told you, hated the Japanese and was famous for his call to kill Japs, kill more Japs, later said that the bomb was an unnecessary experiment. Quote, it was a mistake ever to drop it. General Eisenhower, commander of our armies in Europe, said of the bomb, I dislike seeing the US take the lead in introducing into war something as horrible and destructive as this new weapon was described to me. Even the Army Air Force chiefs at that time, General Hap Arnold, and you may not believe this, General Curtis LeMay, argued that conventional bombing had already defeated Japan and that it was not only unnecessary to use the bombs, but it was immoral to use the bomb. Now, I will clarify something here. As we already know, there is, I think, a great irony. For the Americans did not abolish the monarchy even after the war ended. The emperor remains head of state to this day. Had the US backed away from its unconditional surrender formula, then the war would have ended in July, meaning no sinking of the Indianapolis, no atomic bombing, no later second guessing about the morality of the use of atomic weapons. And yet I have an unprovable hunch that if the US had not used the bomb, nuclear weapons would have been used later, maybe in Korea, maybe in Vietnam, maybe in Afghanistan, maybe by the US, maybe even by the Russians. We'll never know for sure. Counterfactuals are always risky, but I can say with certainty that the devastation of those Japanese cities was a stark warning to us to all of us who lived afterwards. Just 1 year after the end of World War II, author John Hersey wrote a long multi-part series in the New Yorker, later published as a Pulitzer Prize winning book titled Hiroshima, which we have in Herrick Library, in which he described in vivid terms, the horror of that 1 week in August of 45. You can't read Hersey and be unaffected by what he reported. Had the war ended before August 6th, he would never have written that book, and we might well have viewed atomic weapons as just another big but conventional arrow in our military arsenal, just waiting to be used by military officials who almost always act on worst case scenarios. Now, there's one final subject that I want to touch on, and not for a very long time here before I conclude. The World War, the story of the war is huge, involving everything, from my perspective at least, from the 1919 Treaty of Versailles to, which settled, I might add, Germany with huge debt and with humiliation, to the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, to the sordid appeasement policy during the 30s when many conventional politicians in France and England pursued a cowardly policy toward Germany, one that, needless to say, Churchill had opposed. Many viewed Hitler as better than Stalin. They viewed fascism as better than socialism, or they simply feared another war. Even the US was not free from the taint of appeasement. A number of Americans during that period, including Charles Lindbergh, were so anti-Semitic as to turn a blind eye to Hitler's evil, to his anti-Jewish boycotts, and even the certainly the Nuremberg laws of 1935, and even Kristallnacht, in November of 1938, when hundreds of synagogues throughout Germany were set on fire and thousands of Jewish businesses destroyed, many scores of Jews killed. There were a handful of American diplomats who understood what was happening during the 30s. Ambassador to Germany, William Dodd, and Consul General in Vienna, George Messersmith, were outstanding in warning about the descent of Germany into barbarism. And I mention their names right now because they deserve to be remembered for their wisdom and for their courage. Nevertheless, most people didn't get it until it was too late. And so the war in Europe began 2 years after the Japanese had already provided us with a view of the future in the infamous Rape of Nanking, when they massacred literally hundreds of thousands of Chinese. But the killing fields did not only occur on the battlefields. Hitler would kill in cold blood over 1.3 million Soviet POWs. We all know about the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews were systematically murdered for no other reason than that they were Jews. Except that we don't all know about it. I watched on MSNBC just this morning a woman by the name of Deborah Lipstadt, who wrote a good book about, it's called Denial. It's about those who deny the Holocaust, still in this day and age. I asked a class earlier this semester, how many Jews have been killed in the Holocaust? One student said 25,000. Another student guessed that it was 100,000. Only one single student in the entire class knew how many Jews had been killed during the Holocaust. Folks, it drives me nuts. It drives me crazy to see how bent out of shape we get when someone uses an incorrect pronoun or calls the Washington Redskins the Redskins. But we have no problem allowing our younger generation to remain pathetically ignorant of our recent history. Timothy Snyder, a Yale historian who has written wisely about the threat of authoritarianism in contemporary America. One of his books I keep on my desk 100% of the time. Timothy Snyder wrote a sobering book called Bloodlands, in which he accounts for the carnage of the 1930s and the 1940s. It was perpetrated by the totalitarian thugs in Stalin's USSR, and even more directly by Hitler's SS, and also by the thousands of fascist sympathizers in most Eastern European countries, especially from Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine. One of the lessons of this tale is that if World War I and the Balfour Declaration issued by the British, okay, saying that the Jews had a right to a homeland in Palestine, that if World War I made the state of Israel possible, World War II and the Holocaust made it necessary. I'm going to repeat that. World War I made the state of Israel possible. World War II made it necessary. And so the story I'm telling here has vast ramifications that extend into our own time. We ought to remember this history. You will. That's why you're here. And that's why I thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to answer any questions either on chat or if you unmute yourself. I'm going to.
Thank you, Gary. And if anyone's got questions, please ask them. Unmute yourself or put them in the chat.
Order, mute, currently unmuted, Alt+E.
Well,
there's a comment from John D'Angelo. John, do you want to elaborate on that?
am I on mute? Yeah, I'm muted. So there is a book by Sam Keen that I was reading that is about genetics, actually. And he talks in there about there is a small collection of people that actually survived both bombs, the Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb, that just by horrible luck, they happened to be in both of those cities on both of those days. And it's like a small group of people that the Japanese government has actually verified were there on both days. And wow, that's, I don't know if that is terrible luck or great luck to actually survive both of those bombs.
John, the bomb, I might add, the Hiroshima bomb, both cities were civilian cities. There was a military base on the outskirts of Hiroshima that was not targeted. What was targeted was right in the center of the city, a civilian population, if you will. But the bomb was a 14 kiloton bomb. It had it devastated much of the city, but not everything. And there were many people actually who survived the bombing of Hiroshima and of Nagasaki. It depended on where you were in the city. Now, if they were in Central City and they survived, wow! I mean, I don't know how to explain that. But many did. They did survive. In Nagasaki, I think I mentioned very briefly the Nagasaki bomb. There were American POWs in Nagasaki who died. Was that Nagasaki bomb necessary? The answer is clearly no, it was not. Okay, as a matter of fact, it's not even clear that the Japanese had fully assimilated in Tokyo the dimensions of what had happened in Hiroshima. Hiroshima is in the very, very southern part of the island. So, it's difficult to know, how they calculated all of that. But we do know, and this is really kind of the point that I was making, had the bombs never been used, I believe, can't prove this, but I believe the war would have ended at just about the same time. Once the Russians came in, and they were coming in, bomb or no bomb. As a matter of fact, I think the Russians moved up the date of exploding, the date of their entry into the war, in Manchuria, into China, because of the August 6th explosion in Hiroshima. The Russians probably would have delayed maybe for another week. But once the Russians came in, the war was over. The war was going to end. The Japanese were going to surrender. And I thought that what I said about the Japanese War Council and the intelligence report makes that really quite clear.
Okay.
Others, there got to be other comments there.
More comments in the chat. Danny in the chat is asking if there's any possibility that the German guy who was so bad at making planes was a double agent sabotaging German plans.
To my knowledge, there is zero evidence of that. Look, I think that every country houses a certain number of incompetents. How he got promoted to the point that he did, who knows? I have a book on my desk here called The Generals by Thomas Ricks, who's a very, very good, he was a defense reporter for the Washington Post. And he wrote a book called The Generals about recent generals. And the conclusion is that most of our generals, he considers to be borderline incompetent. Okay, that they fought wars badly in Iraq, in Afghanistan. I'm not going to go into all the details. He exempts some people from this, like General Petraeus. But look, I don't know what more I can say about Udet.
Okay, Philip, Rich has a hand raised. Philip, can you unmute yourself? Or
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello, Gary.
Hi, Phil. What's your question, please?
Yes, I'm going to ask it. I have two questions. One of them is in Professor Zinn's book, People's History of the United States. He mentioned something about some kind of communication gone horribly wrong regarding the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that if a communication had got through either from Japan to America or the other way around, the bombing might not have taken place. Would you be willing to tell me what that means?
Well, I'm not quite sure what he's referring to, except to say this. The US had broken the Japanese naval code. So we were intercepting and we were reading a lot of information, cables, if you will, coming from Japan, which is a way of saying that after November 25th, when negotiations over the status of the Japanese troops in China, after they broke down, we knew there was going to be a war. We didn't know exactly when, and we certainly didn't know where. We thought the war was likely to commence in the South, in Singapore, in Malaya, and certainly in the Philippines and in the Dutch East Indies. And the Dutch East Indies, because we knew that the Japanese needed oil. They had previously gotten 40% of their oil from the US. And without that oil, because we were embargoing oil, they had to get it from elsewhere. So we knew that there was going to be war. By the same token, we had information about we knew that there was going to be a war. We did not send it by cable to Pearl Harbor. And the reason we didn't send it by cable to Pearl Harbor was because if we did, and the Japanese had intercepted and they had broken our code, they would know that we had broken their code, in which case they would have changed their code. It would have taken us probably as much as a year before we had, gotten back on track in respect to intercepting their communications. And so, information that might have otherwise got to Pearl Harbor that it would have at least allowed for a more vigorous defense, that information did not arrive. I might add, by the way, that the stunning American victory at Midway in June of 1942, where we sunk those four Japanese aircraft carriers that I was talking about before, the American victory was based on having broken that Japanese code. Had the Japanese broken our code, because, of what I said a moment ago, I don't know what would have happened at Midway, but I have no reason to believe that that would have become the battle that turned out to be the turning point in the Pacific War.
All right, my other question is, why in God's name didn't President Roosevelt allow the Franks, Anne Frank and her family, and the Van Peltzes, who were prosperous business people, into America?
Well, let's not, I don't know about the Frank family per se. American immigration policy during the 1930s was very, very, it was strict, okay? And there was a guy, immigration policy was largely, how shall I put it, in the hands of the Department of State. And there was an Assistant Secretary of State whose name was Breckinridge Long, who was a good old-fashioned garden variety anti-Semite. He had no sympathy whatsoever for the fact that Jews wanted to emigrate to the United States. And this is really important. He refused to allow the St. Louis, the so-called ship of fools.
Yes.
He refused to allow the St. Louis with a cargo of passenger list of about almost 900 Jews from Europe who had sailed to Cuba, who had sailed to Miami. They were left offshore, and eventually the captain of the ship had to return to Europe. And many of the passengers on that ship eventually died in the Holocaust. They wound up, the ship anchored in Antwerp. Some of them remained in Belgium. Belgium was overrun by the Nazis, and of course they died. Other questions?
Steve Pilgrim is just mentioning, he wondered if you knew whether David O'Hara, who used to teach here, did he leave his home in Hiroshima to business in Nagasaki?
No, well, Dave O'Hara came to the United States before the war began. Okay, he lived in Hawaii, lived in Honolulu. About 10 years ago, I had organized a Bergen Forum, which, in my own estimation, of the 35 or so Bergen Forums that I've had here, I think is the best one I ever did. And it was because, in part, I didn't really do it. I organized it, and Dave O'Hara was there. He had been living in Ohio, in Hawaii. George Onoda, the late George Onoda, who taught in our engineering school, who had spent time with his wife in one of the incarceration camps, one of the internment camps in the West during the war. Dave Rossington, who lived in Britain during the Battle of Britain as a young child, and Wally Higgins, who was a member of the Tuskegee Airmen, who was on his way to Japan, on his way to Okinawa on August 6th of 1945. When the bomb was dropped, that ship he was on was turned around and was headed back to San Diego, and then 24 hours later turned around yet again, and he did indeed continue to Okinawa. He said at that Bergen Forum that whatever Ostrower or anyone else might say about whether or not those bombs were necessary, he believed that his life was saved by the use of those atomic bombs.
And Gary, wasn't Lobdell also on that panel?
No, he was not.
Okay.
Nick Schlegel says he has a comment and he'll unmute himself when it's his turn.
Thanks,
Nick.
Amaris. I just wanted to say I appreciate your focusing on Churchill, Gary. It has become popular, I think, in recent times to sort of focus on his many imperfections rather than focus on the fact that he was pretty much a literal bulwark of Western civilization at the time. He was unsupported by his party. He was unsupported largely in Parliament. He was unsupported by the monarchy at that time. His civilian evacuation of Dunkirk and those rousing rhetorical speeches, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that Churchill literally was not only the right man for the time, but as you said, he saved Western democracies from barbarism.
Yeah, look, we're all flawed. At least most of us are flawed. Or at least most of you are flawed. Nick, you and me, I mean,
No,
yeah, he was a very, very flawed individual. And I don't, I'm not disputing what Wheatcroft has said. What I am disputing is the sense in which Wheatcroft, I think, is kind of undermining the sense of, really critical importance that Churchill played during the early years of that war, from 1939 1940 when he became prime minister, and right until 1943. As I said before, after 1943, his role becomes somewhat less than it had been before, because, the US role becomes more important. But I have huge, huge admiration and regard for Churchill. I have my students reading books on Churchill, in my World War II course. I think he was a great man. And there are not that many people whom I would call, quote, great, end quote.
Yes, the original Profile in Courage at that time. I agree.
Anyone else?
There's a question here from Dima. What is the comparative cost of making the bombs compared to the firestorms that the USA would start in Japanese cities, both in cost of money, but also shock and awe? What would be
it's right. The Manhattan Project cost about $2 billion. That's the equivalent today of around $20 to $25 billion. What the cost of destroying those cities? Look, if I may say something about the firebombing, what the Japanese did in Nanking was, this was the first time that a civilian city, a large civilian city, had ever been bombed. And in 1942, what the Germans are going to do in London, and in Leeds, and in Bristol, and in Manchester, and in Birmingham during the Battle of Britain was, I think that we all know what all of that represented. So by the time we get to 1943, when the first firebombing has occurred, by this time, the bombing of civilians by both sides is well underway. Should it have been done? Of course, in hindsight, we say no, it shouldn't have been done. But the fact of the matter is that this was a total war. And I dare say that very, very few Americans questioned it back in 1943. And I would also venture that if I were an adult back in that period, and if you were adults back in that period, you probably would not have questioned it either. We accepted, if you will, a degree, if you will, of barbarity. A degree of barbarity during the war that in retrospect seems, how shall I say, terribly, terribly unfortunate.
I'll add something about Churchill, by the way, in response to what Nick said. That my whole family was very, very left-wing. So they were very sort of critical of Churchill, who was a fierce anti-communist and anti-socialist and imperialist, as Gary said. And certainly my father told me that they listened with some trepidation regarding how he was going to react to the German invasion of the Soviet Union, because he'd been such a fierce anti-communist before the war. But my father also said that basically they all thought he was the right person for the job. And I remember Churchill's state funeral, where they sailed the coffin down the River Thames, and the whole family watched it. And it was kind of interesting that my parents, who were fierce anti-Churchillians, would watch that. Although it's worth remembering as well that there was an election in Britain in 1945, right at the end of the war, and Churchill was trounced in that election.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, he certainly was trounced in that election, and the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, became the new prime minister. And Americans, I think, had a real trouble understanding why that happened. One of my early memories was of Roosevelt's death. The first time, in fact, the only time I ever saw my father cry was when Roosevelt died in 1945. It was really quite traumatic. And for many, many people, remember, Roosevelt first became president way back in 1933. So if you were 12 years old, 13 years old, you didn't know of any other president than Franklin Roosevelt. And Harry Truman, who replaced him, well, he okayed. He's the guy who ultimately authorized the use of the bomb. Would Roosevelt have done so? We don't know. It's one of those iffy questions, the counterfactual. My guess is that, yeah, he would have done the same thing. The program was begun with the intention of using the bomb once it was completed.
Okay.
And I might add, let me say one last thing, Emerson, and that is that J. Robert Oppenheimer, who certainly had a real feel for, if you will, the moral issues involved. Oppenheimer rejected the idea that the bomb be dropped on, demonstrated on a desert island. And he, like a lot of others, like Truman himself, in spite of what Eisenhower and MacArthur and LeMay and all those other people were saying, Oppenheimer believed that it was correct to drop the bomb on Hiroshima at the time that we did it.
Okay, just before I finish, I remembered Churchill's death. Gary remembered Roosevelt's death. Can anyone beat that? Anyone remember Lincoln's death? No? Okay. Then in that case, I would like to thank Gary for a wonderful talk, and surely not his last Berggren Forum. And thank you all for attending.